Hello everyone, Takuya here, and welcome back to the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. And on today's episode, we're going to be answering the simple question, did samurai hate guns? I mean, the simple answer to that simple question is no, they absolutely did not hate guns, but that is a very popular misconception that people have about samurai. And if you're wondering why, well, let me explain. So Japan's first encounter with proper guns was back in the year 1543, this being when a Portuguese ship that was carrying missionaries as well as matchlock guns landed on the Japanese island of Nagashino, which honestly I just find kind of funny because, matchlock and missionary. If I was going to say anything, that almost sounds like it belongs in a band name, but heavy metal isn't the only thing here that's going to be having a lot of death from these. Anyway, at the time that this was going on, Japan was in the middle of the Sengoku Jidai, literally the Age of War. The entirety of Japan was divided into all these different little feudal states that were led by these lords that were constantly waging war on one another in order to try and unify the country behind their banner. Around this time, going into the late 1500s, you had Oda Nobunaga, who was the leading warlord of the time, and he actually did something a little bit different than a lot of other daimyo lords. He actually welcomed Christian missionaries because he saw it as a chance to weaken the local Buddhist religions and the warrior monks that were rising up against him. A side effect of this was also Oda being introduced to firearms and then very quickly implementing them in his own armies. Little side note, little fun fact here, but the reason why the Japanese call their guns Tanegashima is because it came from the island of Tanegashima where guns were first introduced. Another name that they had was Teppo, or in the case of matchlock, literally Hirawaju, the matchlock. Which, on that note, quick sidebar, we're going to need to explain a little something as to what matchlocks exactly are. I could do an entire history on the different kind of shooting mechanisms that belong in different kinds of guns, but you have matchlock, snaplock, wheellock, flintlock. I'm sure that a lot of you are already familiar with flintlock guns, as that's the classic one that a lot of people think of when they're thinking of old firearms. But the first variant of these guns to appear on the battlefield were matchlock, as that was one of the most simple mechanisms that you could have. Once you had a person who was trying to fire a gun and they were holding it in their hands, they would light a little piece of rope, the match, which would either then be manually placed into the hole of the gun to fire, or it would be attached to a mechanism that would snap down, inserting the lit piece into the gun, which would then go boom. Now you're probably gonna look at this and you go, okay, well, why is that important? Well, these early guns were extremely rudimentary, and the problem with matchlocks was that if they got wet, they would not fire. There was nothing really protecting the powder, which is one of the reasons why the Japanese would build these little boxes that would go on top of their guns, and that would actually protect their guns, kind of like a little castle. Nobunaga and others, though specifically in this case Nobunaga, did realize that guns would be significantly more effective when utilized in proper formations and firing in volleys in order to maximize just how many bullets could be directed towards the enemy at any given time. In addition, the thing with a musket, or in this case an arquebus, was that it didn't really require nearly as much training as would be required from other types of weapons, the sword, the bow, the spear, these kinds of things. Which meant that in the case of Oda Nobunaga, that he was able to create an elite fighting force at a significantly quicker rate than those that were around him. Now this is where you're going to get people saying, oh yeah, no, the samurai didn't like guns because they killed too easily. It wasn't something that was good. They needed to rely on this older technology, but no. Once someone was using guns, well, pretty much everyone wanted to use them. Oda was just the best at what he did, and him showcasing just how powerful they were at the Battle of Nagashino, well, that was going to completely change the face of guns in Japan. You see, my friends, at the time of the Battle of Nagashino, you had the Takeda clan, which was a rival clan of Oda's that was laying siege to a castle, and Oda's men had arrived in order to be able to provide relief to the besieged force in 1575. During this battle, the Takeda clans would face an army of a combined Oda Tokugawa force that not only outnumbered them from 12,000 to 38,000, but simultaneously Oda was using a force that had a significant amount of gunmen, in this case 3,000 elite arquebusiers. So what Oda did was that he positioned his men in a field across from the castle and behind a stream. The reason why he chose this position was that it allowed him to build defenses while simultaneously dampening any kind of cavalry charge that came towards him. The Takeda clan, after all, was exceptionally famous for the skill of their cavalrymen, and this was going to be something that they needed to use to their full advantage. The result of this battle was a landslide victory in favor of Oda, as the Takeda would charge again and again, thinking that the matchlocks of Oda were not going to work, but that wasn't the case. They were simply massacred. It was such a huge landslide victory in favor of guns that it completely changed the scope of even some of the warlords who may have been more hesitant to adopt the technology at the time were fully willing to embrace it after this. guns. The proliferation of firearms occurred at such a rate, but by the time of the first Japanese invasion of Korea in 1592, which, mind you, again, was only 17 years later, it's estimated that around 30% of Toyotomi Hideyoshi's initial fighting force was equipped with personal firearms, which gave them a massive advantage over the Koreans that they were fighting in the beginning. Now, ultimately, of course, in the end, the Japanese did not win this war, and for a few years afterwards, they would continue to fight among themselves until everything was united by Tokugawa Ieyasu after the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600. Over the course of this battle, guns were going to be used extensively by both sides, but the thing is, past this point, the glut of guns that existed in Japan just gradually started to disappear. This is one of the things that contributes to people having the idea that the Japanese actually hated firearms, but really, why is that the case? Here's the thing. The samurai did not get rid of their guns because they hated them. They loved them. They got rid of them because they had to. They were being forced to, pretty much. You see, my friends, after the Battle of Sekigahara, Japan was still technically divided into all of these separate little fiefdoms. The only difference is that they now actually had to pledge and fulfill their loyalty to the shogun. But if you had a weak shogunate and a weak government that couldn't enforce that control upon the population, and specifically the lords that had just spent the past of, 150 years fighting each other, then you weren't really going to be someone that was actually going to be in charge. So in order to consolidate his power further, what Ieyasu did in 1607 was to forbid the manufacture of firearms and powder, except for in a place called Nagahama. In order to enforce this, he would actually go and appoint someone as the commissioner of guns, someone who would be able to oversee this. Even in the previous years, there were different elements of gun control that were put in place in Japan, though it wasn't necessarily something that was strictly enforced. Like as an example, one of the things that Toyotomi Hideyoshi had done was to try and convince a bunch of samurai to give up their swords and guns, because then those weapons with their metal would be converted into statues of Buddha, to appeal to them religiously. I can't exactly say what kind of success that thing had. But either way, the idea that Tokugawa had was that if guns were permitted to proliferate among potentially unfriendly peasants and rival clans who still might be a little bit bitter about the fact that he was the guy in charge now, well, they might actually go and use those guns against him. And that is absolutely not something that the government wants. More new ideas, more weapons, contact with foreigners, all of these things were deemed to be dangerous to the government, and so they shut off everything, completely closed it down. Firearm production and innovation were systemically controlled, and it mostly ceased because that is exactly what the Tokugawa government wished to do. The feudal lords simply could not actually produce or develop new firearms as they had throughout the 16th century. It wasn't something that they were able to either pay for due to a multitude of other factors within the Edo period, or that they had the technical expertise to be able to utilize. Instead, what would happen is that limited guns over the course of the centuries would be purchased and used by samurai who would train with these weapons similar to the way that they would utilize bows, swords, and spears. It's just that in an era of peace and tight government control, the gun was something that was more often than not used for hunting rather than warfare, as there really was no war to be had. They just didn't really have much of a reason to use them. Thus, as I said, in the end, the samurai did not hate guns. They just kind of were forced to not be able to use them to the same degree that they had for the previous 50-odd years before the end of the Sengoku Jidai. If they had the opportunity to use something that went boom, you damn well know that they would have. Anyway, that is the end of today's episode. Everyone, thank you very much for listening. I hope that you all enjoyed it, and I ask that you like, comment, and subscribe. Do anything you can to help this video in the algorithm. I appreciate all of you, and any kind of interaction really helps push my videos so that hopefully I won't be stuck in this very hot garage in summer recording all summer. We're trying to move, and in order to do that, we're going to need to get things kicking off on this channel. Your support is necessary for that. Thank you. Goodbye.